to address you, I'm not to undress you. Although you might show some undressed figure. So Eric, you're on.
Sexy stuff. I'll read a few pages towards the end. One of the areas I've always been studying propaganda, as in my PhD dissertation, part of it was looking at cigarette advertising. And I was living in Virginia, and I was able to go to major cigarette companies like Philip Morris and Lorillard, the makers of Marlboro, and look at how they give cigarettes sex, for instance, gender. Marlboro, you may not know, started out as a female brand, and it didn't work, so they shifted it to a male brand, and they were fishing around for the imagery, and they tried sailors, and they tried construction workers, and then bang, they hit on the Marlboro man, the cowboy, which has made it the most popular cigarette brand in the world. So all my career I've been working on this problem all the way up to including through my studies of postmodernism. And in 1992 I spent a year in Bulgaria at Sofia, and I was the first Westerner elected to faculty status in mass communications there. And I remember Todor Zhivkov, the former dictator, was on trial while I was there. And his defense was mostly postmodern. That was the defense. That whatever he did, you can't say it's wrong or right, so forth and so on. And I remember I spent my first semester there, and then I went back to the States for Christmas, and then I came back in January, and I met a colleague in the faculty, and I said, so how's it going? Because times were really still very rough in Bulgaria. And he said, the greatest threat we face is nihilism. It's not even poverty, it's nihilism. And you know, Chernobyl happened, everybody knows that. There was a nuclear reactor on the Danube called Kozloduy. And Kozloduy was a Chernobyl-designed nuclear reactor. When the Soviet system collapsed, the Russian engineers that ran the nuclear plant left, and the Bulgarians were never allowed to run the plant. So they basically just said, "Here are the handbooks and manuals. Goodbye." And so the Bulgarians were like, "Oh crap! How do I run this thing?" And they're pushing buttons and turning levers and trying to read the handbook. Well, there was a big democracy movement, of course, and there was a late Soviet-era rock and roll band that managed to survive underground in Bulgaria, and they became superstars once the Communist Party fell. And one of the things their lead singer did was he started one of the first radio stations in Sofia that was not pure party propaganda. And then he also started a television show called Cuckoo. And Cuckoo was a comedy show. And one of the things they did one night was they pretended to be a newscast announcing that Kozloduy had melted down. And there was nationwide panic. And this became a big controversy. And because of different situations, I actually knew the democratic president of Bulgaria personally. And so he called me up, and other people called, and then I went on the radio of one of these rock stars, and he was talking to me, and he said, "What do you think about this? It's very controversial. My buddies on Cuckoo, lots of people are really angry." And I said, "Well, there is a limit to free speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's not appropriate." And he said, yes, but I know about your Orson Welles and the Martians coming on Halloween. I know about this. And I said, yes, but there's a difference. Martians never actually came and killed anyone. Chernobyl actually happened. And so that's why people were terrified. And so I said something during my little interview with him that all the newspapers picked up later, and it became a big deal. And what I said during my interview was I got frustrated because there was a philosopher there, postmodernist, and he was really into indeterminacy. Everything is indeterminate. And I said, well, are you a Marxist? And he was like, well, I'm neo-Marxist, so forth and so on. And I said, so do you believe in false consciousness? Yes. And as Al pointed out, and what I said on the radio was, there can be no liars unless there's a truth. And I said, I've lied. I've known when I was lying. Sometimes I've been mistaken, and we were really talking about the court case of the former dictator, who was saying, I'm not lying, it's all indeterminate, and it's all just interpretation. I said, no, it's not. Some things are demonstrable. And unless there's a truth, there can't be false consciousness, there can't be lying, there can't be malicious, intentional propaganda. Now, of course, a couple things I learned. My paper, one of the things I'm interested in is what happens with digital manipulation. Manipulating images has been happening forever. But what's happening now with digital technology is that it is virtually impossible to detect manipulation. There are computer programs now where I can make still and moving images that, that can be manipulated, and it's virtually impossible to detect. So I was thinking about this in terms of epistemology and politics. And I was thinking about one of the most famous incidences, U-2. U-2 flew over Cuba in 1962, and they went on out and they saw freighters coming with missiles on the decks. And Kennedy had pictures. And he went to the United Nations and he said, here is photographic proof that Russia is sending intercontinental ballistic missiles to Cuba that could strike any city in the United States within 10 minutes. And people believed it. And on the basis of that valid claim, he embargoed Cuba, put Navy around it, and he said, Khrushchev, you have to turn the missiles around. And Khrushchev initially said, no, they're not really missiles. And he said, no, I have the photographs. Now what happens, people believed those photographs because doctoring chemical picture processing is very easy to detect. Old chemical picture processing is very easy to detect when it's manipulated. But when you're manipulating images at the level of pixels, if a government with a lot of resources can do a fantastic job. Now, Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, they are now working on programs that will be able to detect digital manipulation, but they're not available yet. So what happens if you have a 21st century Adolf Hitler, or whatever the guy you don't happen to like, and he shows up with images that are very convincing that something has happened that would justify war. So my issue here was, okay, as Al pointed out, you can't have misrepresentation unless you have a notion of accurate representation. And Georgi Lukács reminds us that realism is a genre of fiction. But if you live in a totally indeterminate world, what happens to truth? How can you make real decisions, actual decisions? So my friend, he said, nihilism is the greatest threat we face now. I said, that's a pretty serious threat. It's in many ways more serious than poverty. what I was thinking about was, we're all smart. And so we can realize, you know, these pictures might be manipulated. Or they may not. You know, somebody may believe them and then we tell them, no, I think these pictures, these photographs, or this data has been manipulated. And so what happens is you end up in a truly indeterminate epistemic space. So then what happens to the concept of evidence, photographic evidence and proof, to justify any kind of action? And you can be left in a realm where you can't determine anything because everything is indeterminate. So that's part of what this paper is about. Some other things I wanted to talk about here, because my area is communications and propaganda. That's one of my areas. In the United States, we talk about weapons of mass destruction, and we talk about weapons of mass distraction. We also talk a lot about propaganda, and one of my definitions of propaganda is domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism. Now this is kind of extreme, and so let me explain why I have this extreme language that I use. We are inundated by advertising. Now, of course, most people are thinking of propaganda by political parties, and really we sell presidents like we sell loaves of bread now. The exact same Madison Avenue agencies use the same strategies and tactics to sell politicians as well as selling a gallon of gasoline or a liter of gasoline. But it's domestic terrorism because advertising works if and only if it can convince people that they're dissatisfied. And it plants seeds of fear. It's fear-mongering. So, for instance, let me back up a little bit here historically. These are not new ideas. The psychologist Erich Fromm, the existential psychologist Erich Fromm, one time my advisor, Hal Himmelstein, we got a chance to sit down with Dr. Fromm, and Hal said, "Do you watch television?" He said, "No, I don't watch it." He said, "Well, would you please watch some American ads for me and just tell me what you think?" So we ran these ads, and Dr. Fromm watched them, and he became more and more agitated. And then we were done, and Hal said, Dr. Himmelstein said, "Professor Fromm, what is your opinion?" And he said, oh my God, these are images that are telling people they are not loved. They don't smell right, they don't look right, they don't eat the right food, and they're too fat and all this. So the whole thing, the advertising is an assault on being satisfied. And it presents the image, or it presents the product, whether it's a politician or a deodorant or a toothpaste or a fancy car, it presents these as saviors. You can't be a hero or a savior unless you first presume a crisis that you need to be saved from. And that's really what advertising does. It creates this perpetual, permanent indeterminacy and this perpetual fear. It's fear-mongering, that I won't be loved, I won't be accepted, or I shouldn't be satisfied with the car I have now or the house I have now. And so that's one of the reasons why I was sort of disagreeing a little bit with Professor Murphy. Because in the field of advertising, class is always uppermost in your mind. Because there's something called dominance mimicry. Dominance mimicry is a concept that's been borrowed from biology. Dominance mimics are animals that make themselves look like another animal so that they won't be eaten. So for instance, there are moths, and when they spread their wings, it looks like they have big eyes. And there are other kinds of things, fish that appear like other kinds of fish or look like a shark and things like this. Dominance mimicry, the way it works in propaganda, especially in consumer propaganda, is that you have this idea that I really am not a millionaire, but I want to mimic a millionaire. So I can't afford a Rolls Royce. Okay, well, that's okay. Capitalism has a solution. We have class after class, subdivisions of classes, of products. So in the United States, for instance, if you want to buy a mansion, you can't afford a mansion, we have another neighborhood over here that's a little bit different. And it's not as fancy, the woodwork isn't as nice, there's a smaller house, smaller yard. Oh, you can't afford that one? That's okay. I have another neighborhood I've built. And so you go from neighborhood to neighborhood and you can just see the income level of the people who inhabit these neighborhoods. And it's the same thing with something like an automobile. I want a Ferrari. I can't afford a Ferrari. Don't worry, I have a Corvette for you. And you can mimic driving a Ferrari with a Corvette. I'm like, yeah, but how much is a Corvette? Oh, it's about 60,000 US. Holy crap, I can't afford that. Oh, don't worry. We have a Camaro. We'll put a big engine in it and stuff. Okay, well, how much is that? Oh, that's 40,000. Oh, I still can't afford that. And so we just keep moving down, but it's all this attempt to mimic dominance until you're down to a Honda with fancy wheels. But, you know, and so you're displaying dominance this way, and it's mimicry. But it's all based on this sense that we are inadequate. We're afraid we're inadequate without this stuff. So I call it domestic terrorism, and I see it as attacking people's most vulnerable underside, their self-esteem, their sense that they are valued and have worth within society. So I'll move on a little bit more. Another big issue that we have that we're looking at in the United States about propaganda is ownership structures of media. What's happened is, of course, the media is becoming bought up by fewer and fewer people or corporations, and so people can now put out one message that is in books, cinema, television, the internet, and this they call synergies. They can create a synergy effect. So as you switch from one media or one channel to another, it's the same message, and it becomes reinforcing. One of my doctoral students now is working on the concept of stealth advertising. Now, people used to think, okay, we can fight back against this corporate power through the internet, through blogs and things like this, but corporations are really smart. These guys are, you know, they're Ivy Leaguers and they get paid a lot of money to figure out how to make me buy stuff and be miserable. That's their job, make Eric feel miserable so he'll go out and buy my stuff. So they have stealth advertising. So for instance, you may go into a blog where you think you're reading just regular people talking about this is a good car or this is not a good car, and then you may be reading people who are plants. I don't know what a plant, how you said what a plant is in Bulgarian. But Lithuanian. A plant is a fake. Yeah, go ahead.
Så dina ena įvaizdį, tarp tikrų įvaizdžių, tada vienas įvaizdis irgi atrodo tikras.
Yeah, so you're in there reading this stuff and you think, okay, I'm getting authentic opinions from just regular folks who bought this car and they're saying it's good or bad or whatever. And you don't realize you're reading statements written by people hired by Fiat or Ford. So this is kind of stealth advertising. So what it's doing is it's disrupting what initially we thought might be an opening to have this counter discourse with corporate propaganda. And it's also happening even with pharmaceuticals and medicine. You know, pharmaceutical companies are hiring people to spend 24 hours a day going into chat rooms and saying, well, you know, I tried this medicine and it really worked great, so ask your doctor for it and all this kind of stuff. So it's across the board. Now, part of what we were talking about, and part of my research has been on what I call the emerging monoculture globally. And one of the things I was talking about body image. A few years ago, I published a piece called "Cookie Cutter Faces," and I had a lot of students from Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, mainland China, you know, we started talking about this, and Dr. Murphy, one of his students, was really into this too. He was Korean, and he wrote a great piece for this one book I edited. Anyway, what we discovered is nobody goes to a plastic surgeon and says, can you make me look more black? Now when I say this in my classes in the US, the black students are like, what the fuck, what? Hey, that's right. Oh, I don't like that. I don't like you said that, but I also don't like the fact that it might be true. So people go in and they go in and they say to the plastic surgeon, make me look like Brad Pitt, or somebody really good looking like Eric Kramer. So you have this global aesthetic that is now permeating across races and affecting phenotypes. Again, it's attacking us in our most vulnerable places of self-esteem. We don't think our boobs are big enough, or our muscles are big enough, or our nose is too big, or whatever. So it's really funny. You might find this. Miss Korea, they just had these newspapers in Korea, the Miss Korea beauty pageant. They put the pictures up of the top 10 runners-up for Miss Korea. Identical. You couldn't tell them apart. And a few years ago, there was a film director, he wanted to make an epic film about Korea, like medieval Korea. He couldn't find one actress in Korea that didn't have her eye fold cut, so that her eye looked Caucasoid. Not one. So he finally just went to like high schools and found a poor girl that didn't have this, didn't have the wherewithal to have plastic surgery, and he found her and he put her in as star of his movie. Because he was so frustrated. And he taught her how to act, and she actually did a pretty good job. So, okay, so some major theories that we work at that are real common in the United States are things like direct effects. There was something called the Hayes Act back in the 1930s when movies first came out. The Catholic Church especially was really concerned that boys especially were going to see movies and coming out and mimicking the mannerisms and everything of the actors they watched. And so they started smoking and walking and talking like the gangsters and all of this. But then the theory became more complex and it shifted to what's called uses and gratifications. And uses and gratifications said, okay, we're not going to ask what the media does to you, but what you do with the media. How do you select and use media to gratify yourself? And this seems pretty good, but then when you tie gratification back into this notion that you are being dissatisfied by the media, by commercial media, and then how are you gratified by it? So this becomes more complicated that way. And I'll just leave that there because I know time is running. Today we have a theory called third person's effect. And that is where we've done a lot of research. And it's really interesting because everybody thinks the media does not affect them. I'm too smart, ads don't affect me, but they affect everybody else. Because everybody else is an idiot. But not me, I'm smart. And it's really interesting because a lot of the calls for regulating media actually come from this third person effect. And of course we have a lot of evidence that shows that we are all affected by media. Even indirectly, just because of the neighborhoods we live in and the people we interact with and how they treat us when we don't dress the way we're supposed to and smoke the right cigarettes and all that kind of stuff. And so this then raises the issue of normal. What is normal? And that comes in from that is confused with third person effect. I'm normal but nobody else is. I'm rational but nobody else is. And then that brings up the notion of rational choice theory, which has been popular, but there's a lot of problems with rational choice theory because we are condemned to freedom, as Sartre said. Sometimes I want to be free from freedom. I'm forced to choose. But I walk into the grocery store and there's 500 kinds of toothpaste. It drives me nuts. I can't even go in a grocery store sometimes. It's like emotional overload, stimulus overload. So I just tell my wife, you do that and I'll clean the gutters or something really horrible to make up for it. Because I can't go into the grocery store. Really, I'm serious. I go in there, I just start going crazy. All these colors and everything. But there's this notion of rational choice theory, and can we choose not to choose? Well, we can't. We're forced to choose in a lot of different ways by the structure. So, let's see. There was one thing, Al said that journalists are taught to smile all the time, but that's not entirely true. That's a little bit unfair. Like, we just had some really bad tornadoes in Oklahoma, and the journalists were crying. And after 9/11, nobody was smiling. Nobody. Even the comedians. We have big-time comedians. Maybe you've heard of David Letterman. For weeks, they didn't do any comedy. You know, they're all New Yorkers, and they were like, "This sucks," and they were crying on air. They would go on and say, "I know I'm supposed to tell jokes tonight and all this stuff. I just can't." And so, you know, it's there. In fact, instead of smiling all the time, there's another phenomenon that's really weird. Calvin Klein, for example. You probably heard of Calvin Klein. Let's see if I'm wearing them. Calvin Klein. Yeah, it says it right there. Okay. You know, there's both my sons live in New York City, and one of them has dated models. And I've asked him, "What's a model like?" Because I never even got close to one. He said, "They're really stupid, some of them, actually. But some of them are pretty smart." But the thing is, they don't want them to smile. There's this whole propaganda now of kind of like existential angst. So the models are supposed to look like heroin addicts. And they stare out at you from magazines like, you know, it's really strange. It's the opposite. It's negative. It's not positive thinking. It's just sort of like, yes, I'm so gaunt and that's cool. And look at my tattoo. And so that brings up another theory that we talk a lot about, and that's contagion theory. Contagion theory is a kind of two-step flow theory. In fact, Professor Murphy and I were talking last night, like, when did this happen that everybody has to have a tattoo? When we grew up, sailors and Marines had tattoos. And that was it, pretty much. But now, grandmas have tattoos. It's like grandma across their boobs. It's like, yeah, I know, you're a grandma, that's cool. But, you know, it's this contagion. I remember talking to one of my other colleagues. When did everybody start wearing their baseball hat backwards? You know, we watched it happen across campuses. It spread right before us. So contagion theory might be one that you might be interested in looking at. Let's see. You know, everybody's going to talk about Roland Barthes, mythology, Edmund Husserl's natural attitude, and realism and all of that. So I'm not going to go there because that's beaten to death. But there is an issue between fatalism for me and freedom, and whether or not you can, how those two things work. Because in the United States, we're free, but not really. Like I said, we're forced to choose all the time, and there's an agenda built into the consumer product structure where it's really hard to choose not to play the game. Because then you run the risk of being ostracized, stigmatized, being marginalized. You know, if you're not wearing the newest thing. And the only people that can really resist this are people who have status, like college professors. You know, I can come in wearing a weird hat and stuff, and it's okay because I'm supposed to be kooky anyway, and I've got some status. But, you know, if I'm working in a corporation and I'm trying to raise a family and stuff, like IBM or something, I can't do that. I really can't. I might want to be resistant and cool and all that and counterculture and stuff, but I can't. There's just too much at stake. And so the threat is very real in terms of this conformity pressure. Now, the last thing I want to say is one of the big things, and it's already been mentioned, is the middle class. I think the middle class is the buffer. The invention of the middle class was brilliant because it gives the impression that there's real social mobility. And there is. That's the inoculation. There's a theory called inoculation theory. It's a really old theory. You can find it in Plato, even before Plato, and Corax and Tisius, the first sophist. But it's become real hot in social science now, like we reinvented the wheel. Inoculation theory is when a lawyer walks in, and in his opening statement, he says, the prosecutor is going to tell you that my client did X, Y, Z. the prosecutor is going to claim that this happened on Thursday night. And what he does is he's inoculating the jury. He's taking away his case before he even gets to state it. And then he starts to deconstruct it. Well, one of the things about inoculation, so some of us are like, okay, what do we do about this? We're inundated by all these images, and they're made by really slick, super smart people. Madison Avenue folks are not dumb by any stretch of the matter. Very creative. Many of them are trained artists. They're really, really good. So one of the things we try to do is we try to inoculate our students. We try to make the arguments that we know are coming down the pike before they get a chance to make them. But it's difficult because by the time you're in college, you've already seen about 10,000 hours of television ads. So we're really up against it because consciousness has already been structured in a certain way for a lot of students. And that's their reality. And, and if you say, well, you don't have to look this way or that way, like Al was saying, you don't have to look cool or good. Yeah, right. That's not real. Why? Because they live in a social reality where they do have to look like that, if they want to be accepted. So I think that we have to start really early on to educate children about media. And Joe's going to talk a little bit later about media literacy, and he's really good at that, and he'll go there. So I'm going to leave that alone. Last thing I wanted to talk about is a real little piece of propaganda, and it has to do with the selling of the American war in Afghanistan. One of the things I do is I teach graduate seminars on military bases all over the world, U.S. military bases, to commanders, officers. And they're not stupid. They're really smart, a lot of them. And they completely agree with this. I mean, they're embarrassed by it. And one of the things that happened was Pat Tillman. The Bush administration sold us a fake war in Iraq. There were no weapons of mass destruction. In fact, the EU and the International Energy Commission and stuff, they sent people in to look for them. And they were calling Cheney and saying, okay, where are they? We'll go look at them right now. And Cheney was like, well, I can't tell you, blah, blah, blah. Well, what the hell? You told us they're here, so we're here to verify. Well, really what they were doing is reconnoitering so that we wouldn't send troops into a bunch of gas. Once we discovered for sure they weren't there, then we attacked on the pretense that they had weapons of mass destruction. But we knew we weren't going to send a bunch of troops into gas until we knew it wasn't there. Well, in Afghanistan started getting really rough. We messed up. We didn't get the Osama bin Laden. He got away. But there was this patriotic fervor. A lot of Americans even believed that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. They had nothing to do with it. And they also believed that the Mujahideen, Taliban, others were in Iraq. That was all false. So finally, we kind of get our heads on straight, and we're going to go after the guy that actually masterminded blowing up the World Trade Towers. And he's in Afghanistan. So we go there and we mess up, and he gets away. But a lot of people were really wanting to get this guy. I mean, he was like public enemy number one. So this guy comes out of the woodwork. He is a National Football League hero. He's a college football superstar. And his name was Pat Tillman. And he was literally the poster boy for heroism. And we're going to go get the bad guy, finally. And of course, he's handsome as hell. And he's the flag is there, and he's got his beret on, and he's real strong, and he's courageous. And the amazing thing, and this goes into this class warfare in a sense, they're cutting across classes, patriotism knows no class kind of stuff. And that's where I would really agree with John on that. He gave up a very lucrative contract in the National Football League to go join to get the bad guy. Well, he goes there, and we're not exactly sure what happened. But he got killed. And the Bush administration, they were like, oh shit, this was our poster boy and he's dead, damn it. And they were actually mad at some commanders for sending him where he could die. They were like, we didn't want him to die. He was just supposed to look like a soldier, not be one. So anyway, he goes to the front, he's with these special forces, Green Berets, all this stuff, and he's dead. And the Bush administration releases this big story about how he went down fighting, and he took out all these bad guys, And he was heroic, you know, to the bitter end and all this stuff. And then we started to discover, and Al was like, you know, how do you know you've been lied to? Because there's a truth somewhere. And the truth was, he was keeping a journal. And he was a college graduate and a really smart guy, and he began to realize there's a lot wrong with this war. And in this journal, he was recording his doubts. And he started talking to some of the other guys that were kind of knuckleheads, like real stupid gun-ho soldiers. But he's a millionaire football player. And so he's like, I don't know if we're doing this right. And how the hell did he get away? And was this planned and all this stuff? So he gets shot by one of his own men. And the officers, they go into his hut, they take all of his personal stuff and destroy it. His journal's gone, but then later, some of the soldiers said, yeah, we know. There was a journal he was keeping. And then we find that he did send a few letters home to his father, where he had doubts about, you know, maybe I shouldn't have done this. Maybe I should have just been a football player, because I think I was lied to about some of this. So anyway, but people wouldn't buy it. So what happened was something really interesting. The Tillman family wanted the truth, no matter where it led. And especially his mother came out and said to George Bush, what really happened to my son? And Bush was like, well, we told you. He died heroically, charging up and saving lots of men and stuff. And she said, no, I've been told something else here. Now, I could shut up and go away and keep the flag and be happy and that my son's a big hero, but I don't think he's a hero. I think he was a big sucker. And I want the truth. If he's a sucker, I want to know. Because our family has a lot of integrity. And my son had a lot of integrity. And he believed something. And if you use him and abuse him this way, then you erase everything, all the principles that we should be fighting for. So what happened was, a lot of people grabbed onto this image and they started attacking his parents. Citizens in the United States started writing letters and stuff, and conservative radio talk show hosts and stuff started attacking the bereaved parents of this soldier and saying, just shut up. Just shut up, you're like liberal wing nuts. And they're like, no, we're not. We raised this guy. So finally his mother wrote a book. And she came out and she traced out what this happened. Why did you lie about how my son died? And it came out with another propaganda disaster. So this is a classic case of telling one lie to try to cover up another lie. One of the things she discovered was the week he was killed, and all the lies came out about how he died, was just days after Abu Ghraib broke. You guys know what Abu Ghraib was? The prison where the pictures were posted on the internet, where there was abuse of detainees in Iraq. They had dogs and they were forcing the men to masturbate and all this stuff and taking pictures of these prisoners, these Muslim men. It was a nightmare. People in the Pentagon were like, they wanted to commit suicide. This was the worst possible thing that could happen. Abu Ghraib comes out, and also the war in Afghanistan that week was not going well for like 3 months. And so the Bush administration was not looking good. Things were not going their way at all. And so this happened, and they just made up this big lie. So one of the things I would suggest that you might want to look at is the case study of Pat Tillman. Here was a real innocent sucker. He believed his government was telling the truth. He was an educated man, very high grades in college at Arizona State, a stud, big-time football player. He wanted to do the right thing. He walked away from a multi-million-dollar contract, making this big sacrifice, and he was wasted. He was just wasted. So I'll leave that there. I'm not going to read any of this paper because it's just not enough time. Okay, bye-bye.